The wind was a razor, honed on 1,000 miles of frozen prairie. It found every flaw in Alara's threadbare coat, every gap in the wool of her brother's blanket, and sliced through to the bone. Each gust was a physical blow that stole the breath from her lungs and the strength from her limbs. The world had been reduced to three things: the vicious, keening wind, the blinding, swirling snow that had erased the sky and the earth, and the dead weight of her brother, Thomas, leaning against her. He was too weak to walk on his own now, his small, mittened hand clutched in hers, a fragile anchor in the maelstrom. She could feel the shivers that racked his small frame lessening, a terrifying stillness replacing them. Apathy, she knew, was the first herald of the end. It was the cold's most cruel trick, whispering of sleep when sleep meant death. Her own thoughts were becoming brittle, fragmenting like ice. How long had they been walking? The sun had been a pale, indifferent wafer in the sky when the axle of their rickety wagon had finally splintered, spilling their meager possessions into the snow. That felt like a lifetime ago. Another lifetime had passed since she had realized the track was gone, swallowed by the blizzard. Now, there was only the white darkness and the screaming wind. Despair was a cold, heavy stone in her belly, a weight far heavier than her brother. She had promised him. After their father's fever had taken him in that nameless town weeks ago, she had promised Thomas she would get them to Oregon. She had promised him a place with green trees and mountains that touched the clouds, a place where the wind didn't try to scour the flesh from your bones. The memory of that promise was a fresh torment, a new lash from the storm's whip. Her eyes, raw and aching, scanned the churning chaos. There was nothing but an endless expanse of white fury. She stumbled, her worn leather boot catching on a hidden drift, and went down to one knee. Thomas gave a weak cry, a sound almost instantly snatched away by the wind. It was that small, bird-like sound that reignited the last ember of her will. She could not fail him. She could not let him freeze into a statue of her failure. Gritting her teeth, her jaw aching from the cold, she pushed herself back up, pulling him with her. One more step, then another. The words became a silent, desperate prayer, a rhythm against the howl of the storm. One more. One more. It was then that she saw it. A flicker, so faint and distant it might have been a cruel phantom conjured by her freezing mind. A final, mocking trick of the light. She squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them again, shielding them with a hand that felt like a club of wood. It was still there. A tiny, square ember of orange, impossibly warm and steady in the heart of the blizzard. Hope, fierce and painful, pierced the thick fog of her exhaustion. It was a cabin, a light in a window. It had to be. She did not know if it meant salvation or some other, darker peril, but it did not matter. It was a chance, and it was the only one they had. The distance was deceptive. The small light seemed to retreat with every agonizing step she took. The snow was deeper here, piling into great, sculpted drifts that she had to fight her way through, half climbing, half waiting. Thomas was almost entirely a dead weight now, his head lolling against her shoulder. She spoke to him, her voice a raw croak. "Almost there, Tommy. Just a little longer. There's a fire. I see a fire." She wasn't sure if he heard her, or if the words were just for herself, a charm against the encroaching numbness in her own mind. The wind tore at her, trying to rip him from her grasp, trying to spin her around and send her back into the oblivion of the plains. She bent her head, turning her back to the worst of the gale, and shuffled backward, dragging him, her eyes locked on that tiny, flickering star of hope. Finally, the dark, solid shape of a structure resolved itself from the swirling snow. It was a small, brutally simple cabin, built of thick, rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud that was frozen solid as iron. The roof was low, hunkered down against the storm as if it were a living thing bracing itself. Smoke, thick and gray, was torn from the stone chimney and instantly shredded by the wind. The light came from a single, small window, its glass paned with ice that softened the glow within. For a moment, she simply stood there, leaning against the log wall, the rough bark biting into her cheek. The sheer, physical reality of it was overwhelming. It was real. They had made it. But the final, most terrible obstacle remained. The door. Behind it was a person, a stranger. In this vast, empty land, a stranger was as likely to be a devil as a saint. Stories of solitary, Half-mad trappers and desperate men who would kill for a pair of boots were told in hushed tones around town fires. But Thomas's shivering had stopped completely. His skin, where it touched her neck, was cold. Not just cold from the air, but a deep, internal cold that terrified her. There was no choice. Taking a deep, ragged breath that seared her lungs, she shifted Thomas's weight, propping him against the wall. She raised her fist, the knuckles numb and clumsy, and knocked on the solid wood of the door. The sound was pathetic, a dull, dead thud that the wind seemed to mock and swallow. She knocked again, harder this time, putting the last of her strength into it. Again and again. "Please," she whispered, the word a frozen plume of vapor in the air. "Please, anyone." Bolts scraped on the other side, a sound loud as a gunshot in the storm. The door cracked open a few inches, and a wall of warm, fire-scented air washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. A man's shape filled the gap. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, his form a dark silhouette against the firelight behind him. All she could make out was a tangle of dark beard, and eyes that were shadowed and unreadable. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, then his gaze dropped to the small, huddled form of her brother. Alara's voice, when she found it, was a broken, pleading thing, stripped of all pride. It was the voice of pure, animal desperation. "Please, sir," she begged, her words tumbling over each other. "My brother, he's freezing. The wagon broke. We're lost. Please, just let us warm by your hearth. Just for a little while. We won't be any trouble." She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. His silence stretched, an eternity in which the wind howled and the fate of their lives was weighed. She could see the deep suspicion in the set of his shoulders, the inherent distrust of the solitary man. He could shut the door. He could leave them to the storm, and no one would ever know. The thought was so terrible it threatened to shatter her completely. Then, without a word, he pulled the door wide and stepped back. It was not a welcome, not an invitation. It was a concession, a stark, silent command. "Get in." The transition was a violent shock to the senses. From the screaming, frigid chaos outside to the profound, pressing silence and heat within. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, pine, and something savory, like stewed meat. The warmth was a physical presence, wrapping around her, so intense it was painful on her frozen skin. Her vision swam. The cabin was a single room. A great stone hearth dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling and spitting within it, casting dancing shadows that made the small space seem alive. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center. A bed, covered in thick furs, was built into another corner. Along the walls were shelves stacked with provisions, tools, and traps. It was the space of a man who lived alone and lived by his hands. It was meticulously ordered, yet starkly functional. The man closed the door, the heavy bolt shooting home with a final, definitive thud that shut out the storm. The sudden quiet was more deafening than the wind had been. He turned to face her fully, and in the firelight, she saw him clearly for the first time. He was not old, perhaps 30 years of age, but his face was weathered and hard, etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind and solitude. His dark hair was long and unkempt, his beard thick, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, clear gray, the color of a winter sky before a snow, and they watched her with an unnerving, penetrating intensity. There was no pity in them, no welcome, only a grim, cautious assessment. He gestured with his chin toward Thomas. On the floor, by the fire, his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, a voice unused to speaking. Alara's limbs felt clumsy and disobedient. She half-carried, half-dragged Thomas to the spot he'd indicated, lowering him gently onto the worn floorboards near the hearth. The direct heat from the flames was a blessing and an agony. She began the slow, painful process of unwrapping her brother's blanket and peeling off his wet mittens and coat. Her own fingers were useless, stiff and white. The man watched her struggle for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a grunt of what might have been impatience, he knelt beside her. His hands, large and calloused, were surprisingly gentle as he took over, his movements efficient and sure. He worked quickly, stripping away the boy's damp outer layers, then chafing his small, pale hands and feet, his touch firm but careful. Alara could only watch, a wave of exhaustion so profound washing over her that she felt her bones might dissolve. The room tilted, the firelight blurring into a smear of orange and yellow. She had done all she could. She had carried them this far, to this strange, silent man's hearth. Now, her strength was utterly gone. She swayed, her head light, the warmth and the sudden release from the terrible cold overwhelming her. She saw the man glance up at her, his gray eyes sharp. It was the last thing she saw before the floorboards rushed up to meet her and the world dissolved into a welcome, enveloping blackness. She had brought them to the fire, but she did not know if they had found sanctuary or simply a warmer place to die. The silence of the cabin held the answer, and it offered no clues. She awoke to the low crackle of the fire and the unfamiliar weight of a heavy fur blanket over her. For a disoriented moment, she did not know where she was. The scent of wood smoke and old leather filled her nostrils. Then memory returned in a sickening rush. The blizzard, the broken wagon, Thomas's chilling stillness, the desperate trek to the solitary light. She sat up abruptly, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She was on the floor, not far from where she had collapsed, a rolled-up pelt serving as a pillow beneath her head. Her gaze darted frantically around the cabin. The fire in the hearth was banked high, casting a warm, steady glow over the single room. And there, on the floor closest to the flames, was Thomas. He was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sleeping, his face less pale than she remembered, a faint touch of pink returning to his cheeks. His breathing was soft, but even. Relief, so potent it felt like a physical pain, lanced through her. He was alive. He was warm. Her eyes then found the man. He sat at the rough table in the center of the room, his back to her, meticulously cleaning a long rifle. The soft, rhythmic scrape of an oiled cloth against steel was the only sound besides the fire. He seemed completely absorbed in his task, his broad shoulders hunched in concentration. In the dim light, he looked more like a part of the landscape than a man, as solid and unyielding as the stone of his hearth. She watched him, her fear returning, now colder and sharper in the wake of her initial relief. Who was he? Why had he taken them in? No one offered shelter in this land without a reason, and she could not fathom what his might be. Pity did not seem to be a part of his nature. She shifted slightly, and the floorboard beneath her creaked. The man stopped his work instantly. He did not turn around, but she felt his stillness, the sudden, alert tension in his posture. He was like a wolf that had scented something on the wind. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice the same low rumble she remembered, still not looking at her. There is broth on the hearth. It was not an offer. It was a statement of fact. She saw it then, a small iron pot set on the stones near the fire, a thin wisp of steam rising from it. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so fierce it was nauseating. She hadn't realized how long it had been since they had eaten anything more than a dry biscuit. Moving slowly, her limbs stiff and aching, she pushed the heavy fur aside and crawled toward the hearth. She felt his eyes on her back, a tangible weight. She found a wooden bowl and a ladle on the mantelpiece, her hands trembling slightly as she filled the bowl with the thin, savory-smelling liquid. There were small bits of salted meat and wild onion in it. She took a tentative sip. The warmth spread through her chest, a reviving heat that seemed to chase away the last of the deep, internal chill. She drank it slowly, deliberately, forcing herself not to gulp it down like a starving animal. She needed her wits about her. She was a guest here only by his sufferance, a dangerous and uncertain position. When she was done, she ladled a small amount into another bowl, intending to wake Thomas. "Leave the boy," the man's voice cut through the quiet. He had finally turned on his stool to look at her. His gray eyes were just as unsettling as before, holding a deep and impenetrable stillness. "Sleep is what he needs. He can eat when he wakes," she hesitated, her protective instincts warring with the undeniable authority in his tone. But he was right. The steady rise and fall of Thomas's chest was the most reassuring sight in the world. She nodded mutely and set the second bowl aside. She remained by the hearth, drawing her knees up to her chest, pulling her own damp coat tighter around her. She did not know what to say, what was expected of her. The silence stretched again, thick and heavy. He went back to his rifle, the rhythmic scraping resuming. She watched his hands. They were large, scarred, and competent. They had stripped the frozen clothes from her brother, chafed the life back into his limbs, and now they disassembled and cared for a deadly weapon with the same practiced ease. Everything about him spoke of a harsh, self-reliant competence. This was not a man who needed or wanted company. So why were they here? The question circled endlessly in her mind. Was he simply waiting for the storm to pass before he cast them out again? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. The blizzard had been a known enemy, a thing of nature. This man was an unknown quantity, his motives hidden behind a wall of silence and a pair of watchful, winter-gray eyes. Hours passed. Thomas slept on, his slumber deep and healing. The man finished with his rifle, assembling it with a series of satisfying, metallic clicks. He stored it on a rack above the door, then moved about the cabin with a quiet, economical grace, checking the stores on his shelves, adding a log to the fire. He never spoke to her, and after his initial command, he did not look at her directly, yet she felt constantly under his observation. She felt like a stray cat that had been allowed inside, tolerated but not trusted, its every move watched for a sign of trouble. To combat her own helplessness, she looked for something, anything, to do. She saw her own wet cloak and Thomas's small coat hanging from pegs near the fire, already steaming in the heat. He had thought of that. She folded the blanket she had used, placing it neatly to the side. She saw a small stack of mending by the hearth, a pair of thick wool socks with a hole in the heel. Without thinking, she picked them up, along with a needle and thread from a small wooden box. Her hands were still clumsy with cold, but the simple, repetitive task was a comfort. It was something to focus on other than her fear and the silent man across the room. She worked for what felt like a long time, the tiny stitches pulling the frayed wool together. The man had settled back at his table, a block of wood and a knife in his hands. He was carving something, the blade moving with fluid precision, shaving off thin curls of wood that fell to the floor. The cabin was filled with the companionable sounds of industry, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of her needle through wool, the soft rasp of his knife on wood. It was a strange, domestic scene, a fragile illusion of peace in the heart of the storm. She finished the sock, the patch a little clumsy but strong. She set it down and picked up its mate, her anxiety easing slightly with the purpose of the work. She was not just a beggar, taking his warmth and his food. She was contributing, in this small, insignificant way. It was a matter of pride, the only currency she had left. As she drew the thread tight on a final stitch, she dared to look up at him. He had stopped carving. He was watching her, the knife still in his hand. His expression was unchanged, but his gray eyes held a new flicker of something she could not name. It wasn't kindness. It was, perhaps, a reluctant acknowledgement. In the silent, austere world of this cabin, a mended sock was a statement. It said, "I am not useless. I will earn my keep." The storm did not abate. If anything, the wind that battered the small cabin intensified during the night, its howl rising to a vengeful shriek. Alara drifted in and out of a shallow, restless sleep, the sound a constant reminder of the death they had so narrowly escaped. Each time she woke, she would first check on Thomas, his small form a reassuring presence in the firelight. Then, her eyes would inevitably be drawn to the man. He had not taken the bed, but had wrapped himself in a thick fur and settled into a chair near the door, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He seemed not to sleep at all, but to rest in a state of watchful stillness, a sentinel guarding his solitary fortress against the world. His presence was both a comfort and a threat. He was the reason they were safe and warm, but he was also the reason her fear remained a cold knot in her stomach. When the pale, gray light of morning finally filtered through the ice-caked window, it revealed a world transformed. The snow had drifted high against the cabin, burying the lower half of the door and pressing against the single window pane, muffling the sound of the wind to a low, mournful moan. They were entombed in white. The man, Silas, she had heard him mutter the name to himself once, rose from his chair, his movements stiff but sure. He stretched, a powerful, leonine motion, and went to the door. He unbolted the heavy bolt and pushed. The door moved only an inch before stopping with a solid thud against the wall of snow. He pushed again, putting his shoulder into it, and the wood groaned in protest but did not yield further. He turned away from the door with a grin set to his jaw. "We are snowed in. he said, the words flat and devoid of emotion. It was the longest sentence he had yet spoken to her. The finality of it settled over Alara, a suffocating weight. Trapped. They were trapped here, with him. Her gaze fell on Thomas, who was beginning to stir, his eyelashes fluttering. He needed to get well. They needed to move on, to find a town, a doctor, some semblance of a life. But the Prairie had other plans. For now, this cabin was their entire world, and its silent, formidable master was their keeper. A profound sense of helplessness washed over her. She was utterly dependent on the charity of a man who had shown none, only a grudging sense of duty. She felt a desperate need to prove her worth, to show him she was not a parasite. While Silas prepared a breakfast of hot grain mush, sweetened with a dollop of molasses, Alara busied herself. She tended to Thomas, who was awake now, his eyes clearer, though he was still weak and listless. She coaxed him to eat some of the mush, her heart aching at his frailness. When he was settled again by the fire, she looked for other tasks. She saw the pail of water by the door was nearly empty. "I can get more water," she offered, her voice quiet. Silas looked from the snow-blocked door to her, a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps dark amusement, in his eyes. "The well is under 10 feet of snow," he stated, turning back to his own meal. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Of course, she was a fool. She knew nothing of this life, of this place. Defeated, she sat on a stool, her own bowl of mush untouched. The silence in the cabin felt different now. Before, it had been tense and uncertain. Now, it was the heavy, suffocating silence of a cage. Silas ate his meal methodically, his focus absolute. He seemed entirely untroubled by their confinement, as if it were a common and expected occurrence. This was his world, and he moved within its harsh rules with an ingrained competence she could only envy. He finished eating, rose, and pulled on a heavy coat made of buffalo hide. He took a wide-bladed shovel that had been leaning in a corner. "The roof," he said, more to himself than to her. "The weight will be too much." He managed to force the door open just wide enough to squeeze his powerful frame through. And then he was gone, the world outside swallowing him up. A moment later, she heard the rhythmic scrape and thud of his shovel on the roof above them. The cabin felt strangely empty without him. The sheer force of his silent presence had filled the small space. Now, with only the sound of Thomas's soft breathing and the fire, a different kind of anxiety settled in. She was alone with her brother, safe for the moment, but their future was a terrifying blank. She had to do something. She could not just sit and wait. She tidied the small space, sweeping the floor with a crude broom she found, arranging the bowls neatly on the shelf. She checked their meager belongings, which Silas had brought in from the storm, and set in a corner. A small bundle of clothes, her mother's locket, a worn book of psalms. That was all they had left in the world. As she worked, she felt a slow, burning anger begin to replace her fear. Anger at the broken wagon, at the storm, at their father for dying and leaving them so utterly alone. It was a useless, bitter anger, but it was better than the cold paralysis of despair. It was fuel. When Silas finally returned, hours later, he was caked in snow, his beard and eyebrows white with frost. He brought a blast of frigid air into the cabin with him. He shed his heavy coat and went straight to the fire, warming his raw, red hands. He looked exhausted, the hard lines of his face etched deeper. He had been single-handedly fighting the Prairie, keeping this small pocket of warmth and life from being crushed. For the first time, Alara saw past the intimidating stranger and glimpsed the man, a man locked in a constant, solitary battle for survival. He had not asked for them to be a part of his battle. They were a burden he had been forced to accept. That evening, a new, unspoken routine began to form. While he worked, sharpening an axe blade with a whetstone, Alara found a sack of potatoes and a knife. She began to peel them, her small, repetitive motions a counterpoint to his. She was clumsy at first, the peelings too thick, but she focused, determined to do the simple task well. Thomas, feeling a little stronger, sat up and watched them, his young eyes wide and curious. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the small sounds of shared existence, the scrape of steel on stone, the soft thud of peeled potatoes dropping into a pot of water. Late in the evening, Thomas, emboldened by the quiet domesticity, spoke. His small voice was startlingly loud in the cabin. "Are you a giant?" he asked, looking at Silas. Alara froze, mortified. "Thomas, be quiet," she hissed. But Silas had stopped his work. He looked at the boy, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Alara's heart pounded. Then, a corner of his mouth twitched, a barely perceptible movement beneath the thick beard. "Sometimes," he said, his voice a low rumble. "When the snow is deep." Thomas seemed satisfied with this answer, and soon after, he curled up in his blankets and fell asleep. Alara did not dare to look at the man, keeping her eyes fixed on her work. But something had shifted. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall of ice between them. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was the first hint of a thaw. The days bled into one another, marked only by the subtle shifts in the gray light filtering through the snow-packed window. The world outside remained a howling whiteness, a prison wall they could not see past. Inside the cabin, a fragile rhythm took hold. It was a life stripped down to its barest essentials: warmth, food, and work. Silas was a man of relentless routine. He rose before the light, tended the fire, and then began the day's labor. He spent hours clearing snow from the roof, securing the small animal pen attached to the back of the cabin, and maintaining his tools and traps. His energy was formidable, a constant, silent force pushing back against the entropy of the wilderness. Alara, driven by a fierce need not to be a burden, found her own place within his world. She took over the cooking, learning the geography of his sparse pantry. There was flour, salt pork, dried beans, potatoes, and onions, a diet of survival. She learned to make a passable stew, to bake a dense, heavy bread on the hearthstones. She mended his clothes, her stitches growing neater and more confident with each passing day. She kept the cabin clean, a small act of order against the vast chaos outside. These tasks were her anchor. They kept the despair at bay, giving her a sense of purpose, however small. She was earning their keep, one meal, one mended shirt at a time. Thomas, meanwhile, was recovering his strength. The warmth and regular food were working their magic. The listless, pale child who had collapsed at the door was replaced by a boy with a restless energy that could not be contained by the cabin's four walls. He followed Silas like a shadow, his childish curiosity a stark contrast to the man's grim silence. He peppered him with questions, his high-pitched voice filling the quiet spaces. "Why is the fire hot? Where do the animals go in the snow? Is your knife very sharp?" Silas rarely answered with more than a grunt or a single, curt word. Yet, he never told the boy to be quiet. Alara would watch, her heart in her throat, as Thomas would get dangerously close to a sharp tool or the hot fire, and Silas's large hand would reach out, not with anger, but with a swift, sure movement to pull him back to safety. He tolerated the boy's presence with a stoic patience that baffled her. One afternoon, Silas was working at his table, repairing a complex-looking steel trap. Thomas stood beside him, watching with rapt attention. "Can I help?" the boy asked. Silas grunted, not looking up. Thomas, undeterred, reached a small hand out toward a coiled spring. In a movement too fast for Alara to follow, Silas's hand shot out and clamped around Thomas's wrist. It was not a violent gesture, but it was absolute. Thomas froze, his eyes wide. "No," Silas said, his voice low and firm. He held the boy's wrist for a moment longer, then released it. He picked up a small, smooth piece of scrap wood and a smaller, duller knife from his tool roll. He handed them to Thomas. "Carve," he commanded. "Sit by the fire. Do not cut yourself." From then on, it became a ritual. While Silas worked on his projects, Thomas would sit on the floor, diligently scraping away at his block of wood, his tongue sticking out in concentration. He was imitating the man, finding his own small purpose. Alara saw in Silas's gesture not just a way to occupy a child, but a lesson. It was a lesson in patience, in work, in respect for tools. He was teaching her brother, in his own silent, gruff way, how to survive in this world. Her fear of him had long since faded, replaced by a deep and complex curiosity. She knew his routines, the way he took his coffee, the particular way he stoked the fire. She knew the sound of his footsteps, the set of his shoulders when he was tired. But she did not know the man himself. He was a locked room, and she had no key. The meals they shared were silent affairs. They would sit at the small table, the three of them, and eat without speaking. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls and the crackle of the fire. Yet, the silence was no longer the heavy, threatening thing it had once been. It had become a form of communication in itself. A shared glance when a log shifted in the hearth, a nod of acknowledgement when she refilled his bowl. They were three solitary people, bound together by a storm, creating a fragile, temporary family in the vast, empty wilderness. She found herself watching him more and more, noticing the small things. The way his eyes would soften almost imperceptibly when he looked at the sleeping form of her brother. The deep weariness in his face at the end of a long day of labor. The scar that ran through his left eyebrow, a faint white line against his weathered skin. Each detail was a clue, a piece of a puzzle she could not solve. One evening, after Thomas was asleep, Alara was washing the bowls in a basin of hot water. Silas was staring into the fire, his hands resting on his knees. He seemed lost in thought, the flames dancing in his pale eyes. A strange impulse seized her, a desire to break the quiet, to know something, anything, about him. "My father," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He was a farmer. In Ohio. He said the land was tired. He wanted to start again. In Oregon. She stopped, unsure why she was telling him this. It felt like an offering, a small piece of herself laid bare. Silas did not turn from the fire. For a long time, she thought he hadn't heard her, or had chosen to ignore her. Then, he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the flames. "The land is never tired," he said. "Only the men who work it." He said nothing more. But in that one, stark sentence, she felt she had learned more about him than in all the silent days they had shared. He was a man who understood the land, its power, its permanence. He did not fight it. He endured it. He was a part of it. And for now, by some strange twist of fate, so were they. The blizzard finally broke on the 10th day. Alara woke to an unaccustomed brightness in the cabin and a profound, ringing silence. The constant, oppressive moan of the wind was gone. Silas was already at the door, pulling it open. A brilliant, painful slash of blue sky was visible above the mountains of snow. The air that rushed in was frigid and clean, smelling of pine and cold stone. It felt like the first breath after being held underwater for too long. Thomas ran to the doorway, letting out a whoop of joy at the sight of the transformed world. The prairie was a vast, undulating sea of white, glittering under a sun that seemed impossibly bright. It was beautiful and terrifying in its immense, indifferent scale. The breaking of the storm brought not relief, but a new and pressing anxiety for Alara. Their confinement had been a strange sort of sanctuary. In the cabin, their world had shrunk to the simple, manageable tasks of survival. Now, the vast, unforgiving world had returned, and with it, all their unresolved problems. They could not stay here forever. This was Silas's home, his solitude. They were intruders, and their welcome, such as it was, had been predicated on the storm. With the snow beginning to melt under the strong sun, their time here was running out. The thought of leaving, of taking Thomas back out into that vast emptiness with no food, no wagon, and no destination, was a cold fist of fear in her gut. Silas seemed to sense the shift in her mood. He was all business, his focus already on the world outside. He spent the day digging a path from the door to the woodpile and the small, snow-covered lean-to that served as a barn. The work was brutal, but he attacked it with his usual relentless energy. Alara watched him from the doorway, a feeling of utter uselessness washing over her. She could offer no help in this man's world of muscle and endurance. She retreated back to the relative safety of the cabin, her thoughts a tangled mess. She had to speak to him. She had to know what he intended for them. But the words would not form. How could she ask for more from a man who had already given them so much? A man who had never asked for them in the first place. That evening, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Thomas, exhausted from his first day of playing in the snow, was asleep in his blankets. Alara and Silas sat at the table, a meager meal of beans and salted pork between them. The silence was back, but now it was the strained, awkward silence of impending departure. She pushed the food around her bowl, her appetite gone. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She put down her spoon and looked at him, forcing herself to meet his direct, gray gaze. "The storm is over," she said, her voice small and tight. We will be leaving in the morning." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Leaving to go where? To walk until they collapsed? Silas stopped eating. He looked at her, his expression as unreadable as ever. He said nothing, simply waited. His silence forced her to continue, to expose the raw, desperate truth of their situation. "Our wagon, it is broken. Miles from here. We have nothing," she confessed, the words a painful admission of her complete and utter failure. "My father was taking us to Blackwood Creek. He had a cousin there," he said, "but I don't know the way. I don't even know which direction it is." She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers together in her lap, unable to bear the scrutiny of his gaze any longer. She felt like the girl who had knocked on his door 10 days ago, helpless, desperate, and begging. She waited for his reply, a nod of dismissal, a curt, "That is not my concern." She expected him to tell her to be on her way, that he had done his duty and sheltered them from the storm, and now his obligation was at an end. She braced herself for it. The silence stretched, long and agonizing. When he finally spoke, his voice was the same low, gravelly tone, but it held a different quality. It was not gentle, but it was not dismissive either. "Blackwood Creek is 70 miles east," he said, as if stating a simple fact, like the location of his well. He paused, then added, "It is a hard town." Alara looked up, surprised by the unexpected information, by the hint of something that might have been a warning in his voice. He was not casting them out. He was talking to her, engaging with her problem. A tiny, fragile shoot of hope pushed its way through the frozen soil of her despair. He rose from the table and went to a small, battered wooden chest in the corner, a chest she had never seen him open. He lifted the lid and took something out. He came back to the table and placed it in front of her. It was a map, drawn in charcoal on a cured piece of deerskin. It was a crude but detailed drawing of the surrounding territory, with rivers, hills, and tracks carefully marked. He tapped a spot on the map with a calloused finger. "This is here." His finger then traced a long, meandering line eastward. "This is the creek. This is the town." She stared at the map, at the immense, empty space between his cabin and the place called Blackwood Creek. 70 miles. On foot, with a small child. It was an impossible distance. The hope that had flickered within her died just as quickly as it had been born. He must have seen the despair on her face. He let out a sigh, a sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "You will not make it," he said. It was not a judgment. It was a fact. He stood there for a long moment, looking down at her, then over at the sleeping form of her brother. The firelight cast his weathered face in sharp relief, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of conflict in his eyes. He was a man who had built his life on solitude, who had walled himself off from the world, and she and her brother had breached those walls. He turned away and walked to the hearth, staring into the flames as he had the night before. "The winter is long," he said, his back to her. "There is work to be done. The barn needs repair. The wood must be split for the season." He paused, and the entire world seemed to hang on his next words. "You can work for your keep. Until the spring thaw." Alara stared at his back, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. It was not an offer of charity. It was a transaction, a contract, her labor in exchange for food and shelter. It was a chance to survive, but more than that, it was an offer of dignity. He was not offering her a handout. He was offering her a place, a purpose. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she fought them back fiercely. She would not cry in front of this man. She would not show him any weakness. She stood up, her back straight, her resolve hardening like iron in a forge. "I am a hard worker," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will earn our keep." Silas gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes still fixed on the fire. The arrangement was sealed, not with a handshake, but with a few spare words and a shared, unspoken understanding. They were not leaving. For now, this harsh, isolated place was home. The arrangement forged a new and unfamiliar landscape within the cabin's four walls. The dynamic shifted from one of host and refugee to something more complex, a partnership born of necessity. Alara was no longer a guest. She was a fixture, a part of the daily machinery of survival. The work was harder than anything she had ever known. Her father had been a farmer, but he had shielded her from the harshest labors. Here, there was no such shield. Silas did not coddle her. He expected her to pull her weight, and she was fiercely determined not to disappoint him. Her days began before sunrise, the cabin air sharp with cold until the fire was coaxed back to roaring life. Her first task was always to prepare the morning meal, a simple, hearty affair that would fuel them for the hours of labor ahead. While Silas undertook the heavy, muscle-straining work of clearing the remaining snowdrifts and checking his trap lines, Alara's domain became the cabin and its immediate surroundings. She learned to chop kindling with a small hand axe, her first attempts clumsy and jarring, sending shocks up her arms. But she persisted, ignoring the blisters that formed on her soft hands, driven by the memory of the freezing wind and the image of Thomas's pale face. Each splintered piece of wood was a small victory against the cold, a tangible contribution. She learned the rhythms of the homestead. She learned to feed the 2 hardy goats he kept in the lean-to, their musky scent a surprisingly welcome sign of life. She learned to milk them, her fingers stiff and awkward at first, but eventually becoming nimble and sure. The warm, fresh milk was a luxury, a taste of life and sustenance that felt miraculous in the stark, white world. Silas showed her how to properly bank the fire so it would smolder through the night, how to mix the mud and straw to patch the chinking between the logs where the wind had found a way in. He taught her not with words, but with actions. He would perform a task once, slowly and deliberately, while she watched. Then he would hand her the tool and expect her to replicate it. He did not praise her successes or scold her failures. He simply waited, his silent patience a more effective teacher than any lecture. A quiet respect began to grow between them, forged in the crucible of shared work. He saw her resilience, her refusal to complain or give up, even when a task was clearly beyond her strength. She saw the immense skill and knowledge behind his every action. He knew how to read the snow, how to predict the weather from the color of the sky, how to stitch a wound and set a trap. He was a man who possessed a deep and intimate understanding of the harsh world he inhabited. One afternoon, while she was struggling to carry 2 heavy pails of water from the now-cleared well, she slipped on a patch of ice, falling hard and sending the precious water sloshing into the snow. Frustration and shame brought hot tears to her eyes. Before she could even get to her feet, Silas was there. He said nothing. He simply took the pails from her, refilled them at the well, and carried them into the cabin. Later that day, she found him sanding down the handle of a smaller bucket, fitting it to her size. It was a small, unspoken gesture of acknowledgement, a recognition of her effort and her limitations, and it meant more to her than any words of kindness could have. The cabin, once a symbol of her confinement, began to feel like a true sanctuary. She brought her own small touches to it. She found a patch of wintercress growing in a sheltered spot by the creek and added the peppery greens to their stews. She used a precious bit of thread to embroider a simple flower on a spare piece of linen, which she hung on the wall, a tiny splash of color in the monochrome world of wood and stone. Silas never commented on these changes, but she noticed he would sometimes pause and look at the embroidery, his expression thoughtful. The space was no longer just his. It was becoming theirs. Thomas thrived in this new life. The initial fear he'd had of the large, silent man had transformed into a kind of hero worship. He followed Silas everywhere, chattering away, and Silas continued to tolerate his presence with that same stoic patience. He even began to entrust the boy with small, important tasks, feeding the goats a handful of grain, bringing in a specific piece of wood for his carving. These responsibilities made Thomas puff out his chest with pride. He was contributing, just like his sister. He was a part of this place. The harshness of the prairie, which had almost killed him, was now the backdrop for a rugged, adventurous boyhood. He was growing stronger, healthier, his cheeks rosy from the cold air, his limbs sturdy from scrambling over snowbanks. The sight of his recovery, of his simple, uncomplicated happiness, was the fuel that kept Alara going through the longest, most exhausting days. It was the reason she chopped wood until her arms ached and scrubbed the floor until her knees were raw. Every moment of his safety was a testament to the bargain she had made, a bargain she would uphold no matter the cost. The long winter evenings were a time of quiet truce. After the work was done and the meal was eaten, a comfortable routine settled over the cabin. Thomas would sit by the fire, whittling his block of wood, which was slowly beginning to resemble a small, lopsided bird. Alara would be occupied with her mending, her hands moving with practiced rhythm, and Silas would sit at his table, sometimes carving, sometimes oiling and maintaining his traps, the tools of his trade spread out before him. The silence was companionable now, a shared peace earned by the day's hard labor. It was in these quiet moments that Alara felt the bond between them solidifying, not into friendship or anything she could easily name, but into a kind of mutual reliance, a partnership as solid and unadorned as the log walls that sheltered them. They were three solitary souls who had found an unlikely harbor in one another, bracing together against the vast, cold indifference of the world. The deep freeze of winter began to loosen its grip, replaced by the capricious, volatile temperament of an early prairie spring. The sun grew stronger, and the immense drifts of snow began to shrink, weeping meltwater that turned the hard-frozen ground into a treacherous morass of mud. The world, which had been a study in white and gray, was slowly being repainted in shades of brown and a faint, hopeful green. This transition brought with it a new set of labors, clearing clogged drainage ditches, repairing the roof where ice had damaged the shingles, preparing a small patch of earth for a vegetable garden. It also brought a new and unwelcome visitor. He arrived on a day when the wind had a sharp, wet bite to it, riding a fine-looking horse that was wholly out of place in the rugged landscape. The man himself was similarly incongruous. He wore a tailored wool coat and a beaver felt hat, his face clean-shaven and florid, his eyes small and shrewd. He reined his horse in before the cabin, looking at the humble dwelling with an expression of unconcealed disdain. Alara, who had been fetching water from the well, froze at the sight of him. He was the first stranger she had seen since the day their wagon had broken. He represented the outside world, a world she had almost forgotten, and his presence felt like a violation. Silas emerged from the lean-to, a heavy axe in his hand. He moved to stand between the stranger and the cabin, his posture calm but rooted to the spot, a silent, immovable obstacle. He did not speak. The man on the horse looked down at Silas, a sneer playing on his lips. Silas, still squatting on this miserable patch of dirt. I see his voice was oily and condescending. I thought the winter might have convinced you to move on. Silas's grip on the axe handle tightened almost imperceptibly. What do you want, Thorn? His voice was flat, cold as a river stone. The man, Thorn, chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. What I always want, my friend. What is rightfully mine? The land company's survey is complete. This parcel, including your little hovel, falls within the new railroad grant. You've been given notice. It's time for you to vacate. Alara's blood ran cold. Vacate. This was Silas's home. He had built it with his own hands. This is my claim, Silas said, his voice a low growl. Filed and registered. You know that. Thorn waved a dismissive hand. Ah, yes, the old trapper's claim. A quaint but irrelevant piece of paper. The railroad grant, my dear Silas, supersedes all such petty filings. It is a matter of progress, you understand. The nation is expanding. We cannot have stubborn hermits standing in the way of manifest destiny. His eyes slid over to Alara, lingering on her with an unpleasant, appraising look. And it seems you've acquired some company. I'm surprised anyone would willingly share this sty with you. Alara flinched as if struck. The man's cruelty was a physical thing, poisoning the clean spring air. She saw Silas take a half-step forward, his knuckles white on the axe handle. A dangerous stillness settled over him. For a terrifying moment, she thought he would lunge at the man. Thorn seemed to sense it too, as he subtly reined his horse back a step. Now, let's not be hasty, Thorn said, his tone losing some of its smugness. I am a reasonable man. The company is prepared to offer you a small sum for your troubles. A pittance, really, but enough to get you on your way. More than you deserve, frankly. I'm not leaving, Silas said. The words were not a threat or a plea. They were a statement of immutable fact, as certain as the rising of the sun. Thorn's face hardened, the mask of civility dropping away to reveal the raw greed beneath. Don't be a fool. You cannot fight this. I have the law on my side. I have men. You have nothing but a rusty rifle and a half-starved boy. He had not even noticed Thomas, who was peering around the edge of the doorframe, his eyes wide with fear. The casual cruelty of the remark, directed at a child he hadn't seen, was breathtaking. I will be back in 1 week, Silas, Thorne snarled, with the sheriff and a writ of eviction. If you and your family are still here, you will be removed by force. I suggest you take the offer and disappear. It's what you're good at, after all. With that, he wheeled his horse around, spattering mud, and rode away, a dark stain on the landscape. A heavy, toxic silence descended in his wake. The confrontation had shattered the peace of their sanctuary, exposing the fragility of their existence. This small patch of land was not a fortress, but a tiny, vulnerable island in a sea of greed and ambition. Alara looked at Silas. His face was a mask of stone, but she could see the storm in his pale gray eyes. The stranger's final, taunting words, "It's what you're good at, after all," hung in the air between them. They hinted at a past, at a reason for Silas's solitude that she had never dared to ask about. He was not just a hermit. He was a man in exile. Thomas, sensing the terrible tension, ran to Silas and clung to his leg, burying his face in the rough fabric of his trousers. The small, trusting gesture seemed to break the spell. Silas looked down at the boy, and some of the hard fury in his eyes softened. He placed a hand on Thomas's head, a gesture of reassurance that was both clumsy and deeply tender. He then looked at Alara, a question in his eyes. He was not asking her to stay and fight his battle. He was, she realized, giving her an opportunity to leave. Thorne had offered him money. He could give it to her, send her and Thomas on their way to Blackwood Creek, away from the trouble that was coming. She could take the boy and run, leaving him to face Thorne and his men alone. The choice was laid bare before her. She could choose the uncertain safety of the road, or the certain danger of staying here. She thought of the freezing wind, of the endless, empty prairie. She thought of the warmth of this hearth, the taste of the bread she had baked with her own hands, the sight of her brother, healthy and strong, whittling his bird by the fire. This was more than just Silas's home now. It was hers, too. It was the only home they had. She had arrived here as a beggar, pleading for warmth. She would not leave as a coward. She met his gaze, her own resolve hardening to match his. "This is our home," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a conviction that surprised her. "We are not leaving." For the first time since she had met him, Alara saw Silas's grim mouth curve into something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. It was a look of profound, weary acknowledgement. The battle line had been drawn, and she had chosen her side. The week that followed Thorne's visit was heavy with a silent, simmering tension. The air in the cabin, once filled with the comfortable rhythms of work, now crackled with unspoken anxiety. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching horses. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The peace of their sanctuary had been irrevocably broken, replaced by the grim reality of a siege. Yet, this shared threat did not drive them apart. It bound them closer together, forging their fragile partnership into an alliance of hardened steel. There was no open discussion of a plan. Silas was not a man for words, and Alara understood that their preparation would be as silent and methodical as everything else he did. They worked. The work was their prayer, their declaration of defiance. Silas spent hours sharpening his axe until the edge was a razor-fine line of light. He disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled his rifle with a meticulous, almost reverent focus. He was not merely preparing a weapon. He was communing with it, reacquainting himself with its weight, its balance, its deadly purpose. Alara watched him, a cold knot of fear in her stomach. She had seen him as a provider and a protector, but now she was seeing him as a fighter, a man preparing for violence, and it was a chilling transformation. Her own work took on a new urgency. She stockpiled firewood, stacking it high against the cabin wall. She prepared food that would last, salting and smoking the meat from a deer Silas brought back from a hunt, her hands stained and aching, but her purpose clear. If Thorne and his men thought they could starve them out, they would be mistaken. She worked alongside Silas, their movements falling into a seamless, unspoken choreography. While he reinforced the door with a heavy wooden bar, she gathered stones from the creek bed, piling them near the window. It was a pathetic defense, she knew, but it was something. It was an act of defiance. It was a way of saying, "This place will not be taken easily." Thomas, though unaware of the specific danger, was keenly sensitive to the change in atmosphere. His usual cheerful chatter subsided, replaced by a watchful quiet. He stayed close to Alara or Silas, his small face etched with worry. One evening, as Silas was carefully measuring out gunpowder, Thomas approached him, clutching his small, whittled bird. "Is the bad man coming back?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Silas stopped his work and looked at the boy. He seemed to weigh his words carefully. "He might," Silas said, his voice softer than Alara had ever heard it. "But we don't let bad men tell us what to do." He picked up a small leather pouch. "This is your job," he said to Thomas. "You keep this safe. It's very important." The pouch contained spare flints for the rifle. It was a simple task, but by giving it to him, Silas had made Thomas a part of the defense. He had given him a purpose, a way to fight his fear. The boy's face lit up with solemn pride, and he clutched the pouch to his chest as if it were a holy relic. That night, after Thomas was asleep, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. The work was done. All that was left was to wait. Alara sat by the hearth, darning a tear in Thomas's shirt, her fingers moving automatically while her mind raced. The silence stretched, heavier than it had ever been. She had to know. She had to understand the man she was about to risk her life for. "Thorn," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He said you were good at disappearing." Silas was sitting at the table, the rifle laid out before him. He did not look at her. He ran a hand along the smooth wood of the stock, his touch almost a caress. For a long time, she thought he would ignore her, retreating back into his wall of silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, ragged thing, dredged up from a place of deep pain. "I had a wife, a daughter." The words hung in the air, so shocking and unexpected that Alara stopped her sewing, her needle poised in midair. "We had a farm, east of here. Good land. Thorn wanted it. He was with the land company then, too. He used the law, twisted it, forged documents. He brought men." He paused, and the fire crackled, filling the sudden, terrible void. "My wife, she told me to run, to take our daughter and run. But I am not a man who runs." He fell silent again, and Alara could barely breathe. She could picture it, the scene playing out in the dancing shadows of the cabin. "They came at dawn," he continued, his voice devoid of all emotion, as if he were reciting a story about someone else. "There was a fire. I was the only one who made it out." He finally looked up, and his pale eyes were haunted, filled with a grief so vast and ancient it seemed to have hollowed him out from the inside. "I disappeared. Not from Thorn. From myself. From the man who couldn't protect his family." The confession settled over Alara, a weight of profound sorrow. It explained everything. The solitude, the silence, the haunted look in his eyes. He had not chosen this life. He had been sentenced to it by grief and guilt. And now, the same man, the same greed, had followed him here, threatening to take the only thing he had left. She understood now that this was not just a fight for a piece of land. It was Silas's last stand. It was his chance to rewrite the ending of his own story, to protect the new, fragile family that had washed up on his shore. Her heart ached for him, for the terrible burden he had carried alone for so long. She rose from her stool and went to the table. She placed her hand over his, where it rested on the rifle stock. His skin was rough and calloused, but she felt a tremor run through it. She said nothing. There were no words that could touch a pain so deep. Her touch was her answer. It was her promise. "You are not alone this time." He did not pull his hand away. He simply turned his own, his fingers lacing with hers, a silent, desperate grip in the quiet, firelit cabin on the eve of the battle. The day dawned gray and menacing. A low, heavy sky pressed down on the prairie, mirroring the oppressive weight of anticipation that filled the cabin. There was no birdsong. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. They had been awake for hours, a silent vigil in the pre-dawn gloom. The meal they ate was tasteless, a mechanical act of fueling their bodies for what was to come. Thomas was kept inside, his face pale, clutching his leather pouch of flints. He understood, with the profound intuition of a child, that this was a day when the world could break. Silas stood by the small window, a dark, motionless silhouette, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon. The rifle was in his hands, held loosely but ready. Alara stood near the hearth, the heavy iron poker clutched in her own hands. It was a pitiful weapon, but it was solid and real, and its weight was a small comfort. She was not a warrior. She was a farmer's daughter who had learned to survive. But a fierce, protective instinct had taken root in her, an instinct for this man, this boy, this home. She would not stand by and watch it be destroyed. They came just after sunrise. 3 figures on horseback, emerging from the low-lying mist that clung to the creek bed. Thorn was in the lead, flanked by 2 other men. One wore the tarnished badge of a town sheriff, his face bloated and indifferent. The other was a hard-faced man with a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. They rode slowly, deliberately, their arrogance a palpable force. They stopped 100 feet from the cabin, a safe distance from a rifle shot. "Silas," Thorn's voice boomed across the clearing, thin and ugly in the quiet air. "Your time is up. I have a legal writ of eviction, signed by the circuit judge. Come out now, and this can be over peacefully." Silas did not move. He did not answer. His silence was his response, a deep and unyielding refusal. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness. "Don't be a fool," Thorn shouted, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "We will burn you out if we have to. The law is on my side." "He's lying," Silas murmured, his voice so low it was almost a thought. "About the writ. If he had a real one, he'd have brought a federal marshal, not a drunk town sheriff." The quiet observation cut through Alara's fear. This wasn't about the law. This was about brute force. Thorn was counting on Silas's reputation as a man who runs, a man who disappears. He was counting on him to fold. He did not know that this was a different man. The hard-faced man with the shotgun dismounted and started walking toward the cabin, the gun held loosely at his side. "I'm going to go talk some sense into him," he called back to Thorn. Silas raised the rifle, settling the stock against his shoulder, his movements fluid and economical. "Stay away from the window," he said to Alara. He sighted down the long barrel. Alara's breath caught in her throat. The man kept coming, a smirk on his face. When he was 50 feet away, a deafening crack echoed across the prairie. It was not the sound of the rifle. Alara looked at Silas, confused. He hadn't fired. The man with the shotgun stopped dead, his smirk vanishing as he looked down at his feet. A puff of dust had kicked up not 6 inches from his boot. A warning shot. Silas had not fired the rifle. Alara's eyes darted around the cabin. By the hearth, Thomas was standing on a stool, his face grim with concentration. He was holding their largest iron skillet, and in his other hand was the heavy stone he used to crack nuts. He brought the stone down hard on the back of the skillet again. Crack. The sound was shockingly similar to a gunshot. It was a child's trick, a desperate, brilliant piece of mimicry. The man with the shotgun, unnerved, scrambled back toward the horses. Thorn stared at the cabin, his face a mask of fury and confusion. He had expected 1 rifle, 1 man. The bluff, the sound of a second shooter, had rattled him. It was the opening Alara needed. Her mind, which had been frozen with fear, was now racing. Thorn's power was in his pretense of legality, in the presence of the sheriff. If she could strip that away, he would be just a greedy man with a hired gun. She remembered the small chest, the one where Silas kept the deerskin map. On the night he had told her his story, she had seen other papers in there, tied with a leather thong. She ran to it, her hands fumbling with the latch. She pulled out the bundle of papers. Most were receipts and old letters, but one was different. It was a heavy parchment, with an official seal at the bottom. Her father had taught her to read. Her eyes scanned the document. It was a land claim, properly filed and registered with the Territorial Land Office. And at the bottom, there was a signature. The same circuit Judge Thorn had claimed to have his writ from. But more importantly, there was a clause, written in dense, legal script, about the rights of homesteaders on pre-grant claims. "Silas," she cried out, her voice sharp with discovery. "The claim. It says any dispute has to be settled by a federal marshal, not a local official." Silas glanced at her, his eyes widening slightly as he understood. Thorn's authority was a lie. The sheriff had no jurisdiction here. Armed with this knowledge, a new, cold courage filled her. She was no longer just a defender, she was an attacker. She unbarred the door and stepped outside, her heart pounding but her face set and determined. She held the paper in her hand. "Thorn," she called out, her voice clear and strong. The 3 men stared at her, stunned by her sudden appearance. "You are a liar. This is a federal claim. The law you're hiding behind has no power here. This sheriff has no authority. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his face turning a blotchy red. He was a town bully, not a man prepared for a federal entanglement. "This is Silas's land by law," Alara continued, her voice ringing with conviction. "And you are trespassing. If you don't leave now, you will be the ones answering to the law." Thorne's face contorted with rage. He had been outmaneuvered, his bluff called by a slip of a girl. "Get her," he snarled at the man with the shotgun. The man hesitated, looking from Thorne to the impassive cabin door, where he knew at least one rifle was waiting. He looked at the sheriff, who pointedly avoided his gaze. His confidence was broken. In that moment of hesitation, Silas stepped out of the cabin to stand beside Alara. He held the rifle, its dark metal gleaming. He said nothing, but his presence was a thunderous statement. He was not hiding. He was not running. He was standing his ground, with his family, on his land. The standoff was absolute. The three men on horseback faced the man, the woman, and the law she held in her hand. Thorne's power, built on lies and intimidation, crumbled. He looked at the hard-faced gunman, who shook his head slightly. He looked at the sheriff, who was already turning his horse away. It was over. With a final, venomous glare that promised future retribution but admitted present defeat, Thorne yanked his horse's reins and galloped away, his men trailing behind him like defeated dogs. They watched until the riders were small specks on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. The immediate threat was gone. A profound, ringing silence descended upon the homestead, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the new spring grass. The heavy, gray sky began to break apart. An array of sunlight pierced through the clouds, illuminating the small cabin in a pool of pale gold light. Alara stood beside Silas, the parchment still clutched in her hand, the paper fluttering slightly in the breeze. Her entire body trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear, but she stood tall. She had not cowered. She had not hidden. She had faced the threat head-on, using her mind as a weapon, and she had won. Silas slowly lowered the rifle, the tension draining from his powerful frame. He looked at her, his pale gray eyes holding an expression she had never seen before. It was a look of awe, of profound, unadorned respect. He had been prepared to meet violence with violence, to defend their home with blood. But she had found another way. She had used the very tool of the civilization he had abandoned, the law, to protect their wild sanctuary. Thomas came running out of the cabin, his face streaked with grime, and threw his arms around Silas's legs. "We did it," he shouted, his voice filled with a child's pure, uncomplicated triumph. "We scared the bad man away." Silas reached down and lifted the boy into his arms, a gesture of such natural, paternal affection that it made Alara's heart ache. He held Thomas close, burying his face for a moment in the boy's tangled hair. When he looked up again, his eyes met Alara's over Thomas's head. In that shared gaze, everything was said without a single word being spoken. The last of the walls between them, the final vestiges of their identities as stranger and refugee, dissolved completely. They were no longer just allies of convenience, but partners, forged into a single, resilient unit by shared hardship and shared victory. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the prairie, they stood together and surveyed their land. The air was cool and clean. The earth smelled of damp soil and new life. It was a harsh, demanding land, but it was theirs. It was a place they had fought for, a place they had earned. Alara thought back to the desperate, freezing girl who had stumbled to this door months ago, begging for mercy. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own strength, who had found her own voice. She had come to this place seeking shelter, but she had found something far more valuable, a home, a family, and a sense of her own unshakable worth. The narrative of her life, which she had thought was a story of loss and flight, had been rewritten. It was now a story of resilience. It was the story of a woman who had walked through a storm and found not an end, but a beginning. Silas came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, comforting warmth in the cooling air. He did not touch her, but she could feel his nearness, a quiet promise of shared tomorrows. The future was still an unknown country, a vast and wild prairie stretching out before them. There would be other storms, other threats. The world was not a kind place, but they would face it together. The fire in the hearth inside the cabin was burning brightly, a beacon against the coming night. They had warmth. They had each other. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything.